Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this, our third session in the Sanctuary What Next series on anti-detention and anti-deportation. We're being hosted today by Ryerson University in Toronto, and we want to start our session by acknowledging the unique connections and relationships Indigenous persons and their ancestors have had with the land for thousands of years. Indigenous persons and their Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So we start with that land acknowledgement, and I think it particularly resonates with our topic today as we think about campaigns such as no one is illegal on stolen lands, and issues to do with deportation and expulsion from territory. My name is Dr. Rachel Humphreys from Queen Mary, University of London, and this is my co-organizer for the event, Dr. Graham Hudson at Ryerson University in Toronto. I won't speak for long at all, but just to give you some context for the event, Graham and I began planning this last year in Toronto, and it was going to be a big in-person conference, but we've moved online with the pandemic, and now we're delighted to have 6 standalone but interrelated forums, all dealing with the pioneering work being done in cities by, with, and for undocumented and precarious status residents. This forum, as I said, is the third, and I hope you can join us for the others. Tomorrow there is a session on decent work, and next week we're focusing on access to education and access to health. If you can't make it on the day, the recordings will be made available on the Ryerson website and on YouTube. And the first 2 sessions last week on race, migration, and policing, and the second one on intersectional solidarities and coalition building are already ready and available for you to watch on YouTube, and we can post the links in the chat section. Some brief housekeeping issues before we begin. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A function. Please state if the question is directed at a particular speaker or for the panel as a whole. Please also feel free to post any material that you have produced or your organization, and we will endeavor to collect it and share it with everyone, as I know we're all here to learn and share from each other on these really important issues. You can also tweet about this event using the Sanctuary What Next hashtag, and I think I will leave it there and hand it over to Graham.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'd like to just spend some time giving thanks to those who helped make all of this possible. And of course, I have to start by thanking today's panelists and the chair. And we'd also like to thank all of our presenting partners, which include Queen Mary University of London, the University of San Francisco, Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, No One is Illegal, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice. We'd like to also thank the Ryerson University Faculty of Law, Dean Donna Young, for all the help and assistance and encouragement for this series, as well as the Faculty of Arts, Dean Pamela Sugerman, who originally contributed cash money to help us launch the 3-dimensional version of the conference that we had imagined would happen. Nonetheless, thanks very much for promising to help in that regard. We'd like to thank the entire planning committee, as well as all of the different community partners who helped connect us with presenters and have inspired and shaped the series, as well as our collective work. Definitely a very strong thank you to the media services team, Luke and Brian. This is now our 3rd panel, and it's gone off without a hitch, thanks in large part, if not exclusively, to their handiwork. And then we'd like to thank today's chair, Dr. Peter Manzina, who is currently in Budapest, Hungary, just to add another time zone, I believe, to the equation. Peter is a cultural and political anthropologist who studies governmental power, policing, immigration control, policy implementation, and social movement organizing. He's currently doing lots of different things, including serving as a research associate at the University of Oxford. He's a researcher at Stockholm University in social anthropology and is a visiting scholar in the Center for Immigration Law, Policy and Justice at Rutgers Law School. He's currently writing a book entitled Sanctuary City in the Age of Mass Deportation. The book examines decades of local experimentation with implementing sanctuary city policies in San Francisco, where he's very well known indeed. Peter has worked as a consultant to universities and nonprofit organizations, government lawmakers, and regional transit authorities, all on how to organize resistance to local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement. He's also assisted these local institutions and organizations and agencies in developing policy. As one prescient example, from 2013 to 2017, he was an organizing researcher for the Service Employees International Union, Local 1021 in San Francisco, and he helped the process of unionizing contingent university faculty and municipal government worker opposition to the attempted federal defunding of sanctuary cities, a struggle that's ongoing. Peter, please take it away.
You're not coming through, Peter.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. That's perfect.
Okay. So thank you very much, Rachel and Graham, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful series of forums. I'm really excited to hear from these wonderful leaders about what the surveillance state, the carceral state, these apparatuses of capture are rapidly turning into with the use of new technologies for data collection and data sharing. I'm also really excited to get into the conversation about what abolition looks like at this nexus of the fight against immigration control and the fight against the prison industrial complex and against the police. We're seeing, of course, that anti-deportation and anti-detention work is increasingly being focused on further advancing the goals, the strategy, the demands, not only of immigration enforcement and detention abolition, but also racial justice organizing and prison abolition. We can see this linked approach really mainstreaming if we look at how the demands of sanctuary city-focused immigrant rights organizations, for instance, have changed. More and more have increasingly been turning away from a discourse that argued for the creation of sanctuary jurisdictions on the basis that they foster immigrant cooperation with the police or the state. And they've been moving more in the direction of demands to defund, dismantle, and abolish the police, abolish national immigration agencies like the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Customs and Border Protection, as well as abolishing the borders that those agencies police, and arguing for closing jails, prisons, detention centers, and closing camps. At the local level, organizations are less distinguishable as purely immigrant rights organizations alone. They're really working at this nexus of racial justice, prison and immigrant detention abolition, and immigration enforcement abolition. We've seen people we might have previously only called migrant activists demand that jails and prisons not only stop all transfers of people to immigration officials for deportation, but also permanently free prisoners during the COVID pandemic. We've seen immigrant rights and pro-sanctuary activists successfully halt the construction of new local jails, pass state policy to prohibit the contracting of private immigration, immigrant detention centers, and to prohibit the use of local jails and other criminality-focused detention facilities from cooperating deportations. So today, we're going to talk with a group of leaders from the US, the UK, and Canada who've gotten up and close and personal with the carceral state. They've seen how it works, how it's attempting to trap and control people's mobility, how it's targeting racialized and urban populations. These are folks who've also brought their movements together with local government leaders to stop deportations, stop the expansion of immigrant detention centers and jails, and counter the expansive data collecting and data sharing projects that facilitate surveillance, policing, and immigration enforcement. So that said, I'd like to now introduce the speakers. The first person I'd like to introduce is Sohail Bensleiman, who is the coordinator of the Jail Accountability and Information Line in Ottawa, Canada. Sohail is a father and an illegalized and criminalized migrant who is currently awaiting imminent deportation to Morocco. After serving a federal sentence and being released from immigration detention in March 2018, Sohail became involved in abolitionist as well as prisoner and migrant justice organizing as a member of the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project. He also worked as a member of the Ottawa Sanctuary City Network and as the coordinator of the Jail Accountability and Information Line. He's also a co-author with David Moffett of the peer-reviewed article that's entitled "The Double Punishment of Criminal Inadmissibility for Immigrants," which appeared in the Journal of Prisoners on Prisons. Sohail, thank you so much for being with us today. We are super excited you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next, I'd like to introduce Mac Scott, who is based in Toronto, Canada. Is Mac here with us? I'm not sure if he joined the call or not. I can move to him later if he's not here yet.
That might be best. Yes, he's not with us yet.
Okay. So then the next leader I'd like to introduce is Angela Chan in San Francisco, California. Angela is Policy Director and Senior Staff Attorney managing the Criminal Justice Reform Program at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. Since 2008, she's focused on defending and passing laws to limit local and state law enforcement from participating in immigration enforcement, which in the US is the job of the federal government, not local cops or sheriffs, so they often do that work voluntarily. She collaborated with the ICE out of California statewide coalition to co-author and pass the California Trust Act to stop detention facilities throughout the state from responding to requests from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency to detain people and turn them over to the federal government for deportation. She also co-authored the Truth Act to require local law enforcement to provide consent forms to people in detention before the facility lets ICE interview them. And most recently, she co-authored the California Values Act, also known as SB 54, which is the strongest and broadest sanctuary state law in the US. For this work, Angela's received many honors and awards. And Angela, it is great to see you. Thank you so much for being here with us. The next panelist I'd like to introduce is Sam Grant, who is Policy and Campaigns Manager at the organization Liberty in London. Sam works on ending immigration detention, mental health issues, military justice issues, and protecting the Human Rights Act. Before joining Liberty, Sam was campaigns manager at René Cassin, where he engaged and mobilized the British Jewish community on immigration detention, discrimination towards minorities, and modern slavery issues. He also was a volunteer for Rights Info and a founding trustee of the Advocacy Academy, and he holds a master's in human rights from the London School of Economics. Sam, thanks so much for being with us also.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be here.
Next we have with us today, Penny Wangari-Jones. Penny is an anti-racist activist and organizer and is director of the Racial Justice Network. She's currently undertaking a PhD at the University of Manchester, where she's focusing on how coloniality shapes Black activism. Born and raised in Kenya, her experiences of discrimination and racism after migrating to the UK became a catalyst for fighting for racial and social justice. Over the past 12 years, she's worked with marginalized communities affected by mental health, homelessness, poverty, addictions, domestic abuse, sex work, destitution, seeking asylum, and refuge. The Racial Justice Network that she directs is a network of individuals, communities, and organizations working together to end racial injustice and address legacies of colonialism. The Racial Justice Network is a lived experience-led and informed anti-racist organization based primarily in the Leeds City region of England and working in West Yorkshire and beyond. As part of her work with the Racial Justice Network, Penny has been examining how police in the UK are using biometric data and linking it with immigration databases to monitor and track racialized groups. Penny has also examined how COVID track and trace data could be used by the Home Office to funnel people into detention and deportation. Thank you so much, Penny, for being with us. We're really excited you're here.
Thank you for having me.
So now I'd like to, if Mac is not here, I'd like to move into our discussion with these great panelists. There are a variety of frontiers, or rather aspects of the anti-deportation anti-detention and abolitionist struggle that we're facing. And though we have an hour and a half right now, this is going to fly by. So we're going to focus on some of the major types of struggle right now. And Rachel and Graham have made some really good suggestions that we focus on the technology and surveillance frontier struggle, the struggle within the policy arena and working with or struggling against government to stop deportations and the expansion of the carceral state, and the struggle for abolition. So to start us off, I'd like to first talk about what we're actually facing and what we need to confront when we do anti-deportation work and anti-detention work. A lot of this comes down to disrupting the ways that the carceral state sees us, documents us, and uses that data to find us, track us, arrest us, detain us, incarcerate us, and deport us. It also comes down to knowing just how the state is not only using deportation forces, but also how it is trying to conscript non-law enforcement agencies into helping in immigration enforcement. So I'd like to first turn to our UK leaders, to Sam, who I'd like to give us a sort of an understanding of what's happening there right now in the UK. Sam, we've heard from panelists in the previous two panels in this series about the hostile environment policy. And I know your organization, Liberty, has also recently had major legal victories against police use of facial recognition software, and has been working to examine how the Home Office makes deals with schools, hospitals, job centers, and the police to access local department data they can use to track down children and adults for deportation. This is all stuff outlined in Liberty's report, Care, Don't Share, if anybody out there is interested in reading further about that. But Sam, could you tell us how the criminalization of immigration and immigrants is playing out there in terms of targeting people with this kind of tech, sharing information about them across agencies, and detaining and deporting irregularized migrants?
Thanks, Peter, and thanks again for having me. It's great to be on such an international panel with other fantastic panelists. And I think I'm as excited to hear from Penny, Angela, and Sohail as everyone who's tuned in. So in terms of tech and immigration, I will put a link into our Care Don't Share report so people can read. I'll probably reference it a few times. I think a good place to start is kind of what might be on the horizon and what we're concerned about. Last year, we were preparing and heard was essentially of the government wanting to put together what was in effect a massive migrant database, which they were terming the status checking project. Very very much kind of informed and connected to the process of Brexit and what's going on for EU nationals in the UK at the moment. That database would be accessible not only by the government, but also by private agencies. It's very likely that a broad range of agencies and public services, such as hospitals, GPs, schools, landlords, employers, department banks, they will database was holding about you, whether you could object to your data's inclusion on it, and whether you could appeal against incorrect. Actually, still looking to challenge that as soon as possible when there's kind of more shape to what that might look like. Obviously, Liberty's Care Don't Share campaign work, which was campaigning to put a firewall between public services and immigration enforcement, stopping data being shared for immigration purposes, which would mean that people wouldn't be afraid to report crimes at hospital for treatment over fear that it might lead to their deportation. I guess the other thing to think about in terms of this is how surveillance could then be linked to those databases. Peter mentioned our campaigning work against facial recognition. One of the concerns that we have about any development of a database would be that facial rec could then be used as a tracking mechanism, used to surveil already over police communities that we know about. So I think that those would be either in the UK. I'm sure Penny would have more detail and a few other things to offer, but that's where I'd start.
Thank you very much, Sam. And before I move on to Penny, can you briefly just tell us what strategies are you finding to be most effective in working to combat the narratives about criminality and migration that have arisen in the wake of this kind of surveillance and this more diffuse search and capture kind of approach?
Yeah, I'm looking back on, particularly on the tech side of things, we're finding early interventions are vitally important, and stopping and voicing opposition early as you can. Out soon as you hear races about new plans of surveillance those databases, and really trying to scare off immigration enforcement, police, government from even getting going on these things. Skilling ourselves up and so that we understand tech is really important. I think there's a narrative to push back against in terms of tech solutionism, knowing that a lot of it can't be the solution. It will only entrench existing problems, and also making the point that actually a lot of systems that might trial on migrant population then only serve to increase and then be used on the population. I think is an important linking point. I think in terms of reality more generally, I think you know that it's important to spend too much time. Firstly, I was going to warn people off looking at the Home Office Twitter account in the UK. If you do want to have a look at it, make sure you're fully caffeinated before you do it. But that is full of this link between dangerous foreign criminals and the immigration system. I think it's important that we don't get embroiled into spending day and responding to kind of the latest ministerial statement, latest tweet from the government on this, but it is very much a framing battle, and we have to know what our frames are. We have to be careful not to play the same game and not get drawn into saying who's innocent, who's not innocent. And we have to remember kind of that it's the structures and not that should be part of it. So it really is really kind of taking a step back and thinking about that framing, and being firm on that narrative that you're pushing.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'd now like to turn to Penny. Penny, your work to confront and stop racism in the UK has been very multifaceted. And one of the major focuses of that work has been on surveillance and the use of biometric data, the use of mobile fingerprint sharing tech by police that links up to Home Office immigration databases, and more recently on COVID tracing and its potential uses to facilitate arrests, detentions, and deportations. Can you tell us about your work in this area and what you see as the new digital frontiers that are driving the tracing mechanisms which pick up undocumented migrants? how can we maintain an understanding of these complex systems, especially when they're shifting so rapidly?
Yeah, I think just to pick up on where Sam left off, because I'm glad that the hostile environment was started or spoken about in the previous session. So and the angles that the hostile environment was delivered in terms of employment, housing, schools, and all of that. So our work, and again, I'll put the link on the chat later on. With the campaign called Stop This Can, emerged out of us particularly looking at how policing, so the extra strand of policing being used or becoming border force. So the hostile environment obviously clearly made everybody else border force, the landlords, the GPs and everybody else. So, but this one was particularly around the police. And what it means is and the reason why we kicked off or we started off was that idea that when somebody has suspected of committing a crime, the police can stop them, and before they could stop, ask you who you are and you identify yourself, and then if there is need for an arrest, they take you to the police station and they fingerprint you there. Now with this new technology of mobile fingerprint, it's like literally a phone, and they get you to put your finger on there. And when you do, it has access to not just your the Criminal Records Bureau, but the Home Office. So the people who are likely to be identified is people who have migration history and criminal history. So when we found out about this, which it was piloted in West Yorkshire in Leeds in 2018, we kind of engaged with the crime commissioner or the police at that point and asked the ethics, what have you followed? Who did you check with about this? And the response was, we've been doing this anyway for 10 years, so we didn't need to do an ethics. But what it really highlighted, it was snacking. So at that point, there was only 9 machines, but they had 250 in storage funded by the Home Office. So for us to go through a procedural process of about 8-9 months of engaging and asking for data, because at that point, and I think it's clear for most people who know about stop and search and the fact that stop and search heavily targets Black and brown communities. And we were saying this has an extra factor of people who have migration history. So we were asking, how can you, so they said they had no data. So how can you not have data when you know everybody else is kicking off about how it discriminates Black and brown communities? So what they ended up doing is, because we wanted to know who's been stopped, why were they stopped, what was the outcome of that stop? And they didn't have anything. So it took us to start and launch a campaign to get this data through the Freedom of Information to then actually put the case forward, which we've continued to do. And we know, and I think this is the other angle to it in terms of how do we maneuver. We know for some, police, and I know this is kind of with the whole campaign around abolition and defund the police are there to protect the interests of a few. So for me as a Black woman, I don't go out there and see police and think, oh, I'm safe. And I imagine a lot of people who've had some interactions with the police where racism, discrimination, or even poor communities don't think that. But with this one, they're not even doing the job of protecting. So the angle we've been asking is, with the hostile environment and the fear and anxiety with not just Black and brown communities, migrant communities, poor communities, people are not coming to you when they need protection. So you're not even doing the role that you say that you're supposed to be doing. So there's other angles like people who've been trafficked in the country, people who are modern slaveries or experiencing modern slavery, people who are homeless now being picked up from the streets, being fingerprinted. And I know this was a law that they started doing with the EU citizens some time back. It was ruled, people went to court, they stopped it, and they're going to restart it in January. But we've also already heard that they're already doing it now when they're going picking up people in the streets. So similarly to, because with what Sam was saying, we're also asking for firewall between the police. If your job is to do this, you need to detach yourself from the Home Office, detach your services with the Home Office, because what we're seeing is that handing over, they're out and about. We don't have Home Office or the migration officers loitering the streets. We've had incidents where somebody goes to report a crime, i.e. a woman reporting rape, and I think this was covered in the newspapers or in the media. And then suddenly you're being asked for your status. How long have you been here? Who are you? Where is your identity? So you move very quickly from being a victim to being a detainee and then potential deportation. So for us, the angle that we're pushing on is that one. So the routine stop and search, and this is the other angle of the policing, is they're also contributing to court cases. So we know with Operation Nexus in London, for example, this stop and search where young people are hanging about the street corners and they're booked or whatever it is, this actually manifests and has an impact when they come to go or seeking status or seeking citizenship, that actually it has an impact. So for us to continue asking for this firewall is, if the police role is this, they need to stop it, because they've been going into court cases and contributing, saying they're a good child or not a good child, and that has impact, especially from parents who, as you imagine, who fled whatever they felt, which we say is obviously related to colonial legacies. They're coming here, they're trying to resettle. First of all, they're hit with discrimination, racism, de-skilling, which happens again with people with multiple degrees not able to work or not able to find roles that suit themselves. They're trying to get by, and then this thing happened. This thing kind of also adds to their experience. So what we see also in terms of the track and trace is the same, because that track and trace app is also added to that, the same phone item. So the technology is coming fast, and it's kind of completely like mind-blowing. It's coming really fast, but they're adding to, and the frustration we feel is those of us who are out there campaigning, mobilizing or organizing, it takes us a while, and we can work so long for so many months to go and do something, but for them, they can just drop it just like that. And then it takes us a long time. So the tactics that we are using in terms of the question you ask around what are we deploying, on this particular campaign, we have like 9 strands. And what we're trying to say and seek and ask others is to see the interconnectedness of the injustice, because what we've had is a kind of divide and rule, or divide and conquer tactic. So we only see and work on one element. So as an organization, we say we work in a center race, but how race intersects with class, with migration, with gender, with all of these things, climate. And if those of us who are fighting around social justice issues, if we can see and continue to see the multiple angles, we're able to kind of work towards and move forward better. So with this particular strand, we have like we're seeking legal experts, because we're not legal experts. So we are asking, and we have had and been lucky enough to find people, because I think we're also listed on the Liberty book, that care one, around what we're doing. We're seeking and raising awareness. So we're asking also for, because I think the fight doesn't have to be just with activists and organizing campaigners in the streets. It also needs to be done by academics. So academics write about staff and communities. How do they write in a way that actually informs policy? So we're asking, so like we launched a survey, which actually finished today, bound to come out next week, but it's being done by researchers who are campaigning and working with us. We're also seeking and asking people who are working on climate and talking about climate to see how climate is connected to foreign policies, is connected to weapons being sold, is connected to people trying to cross over on the Mediterranean dying, and people in detention centers. So we're asking, if we care enough about this, you should care about this. And I think that angle of also the criminality that we see, because I think the point that was made earlier, that the anxiety that the narrative and the politicians and the media drives in people of, we want criminals locked up. Actually, do we understand why people commit crimes? Do we see how the socioeconomic conditions have pushed certain things? Are they criminals? Because we've know, for example, people who are seeking asylum in the UK are not entitled to work. And then if you're destitute, you're also not entitled to get any support. You try and get an odd job. If you're caught on that job, then you're criminalized, you put in prison. And when you put in prison, when you come out, the next direction is deportation, detention and deportation. So again, for people working on abolition, can you understand how migration works? And so that whole interconnected is what we're really trying to work on, and being kind of multifaceted, as you say. And we've seen things shift. We've seen other campaigns and other work that we do shift, and we're hoping for more and more of that to do. But that angle of seeing and working with international as well, rather than just focusing on what's happening here. And I think this is also an example being in this evening. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Penny. I want to move to Angela in San Francisco now. Angela, can you dig into these same two questions for us and tell us what you're seeing on the one hand in terms of the criminalization of migration and race, how that's playing out in terms of detaining and deporting people, but also how new digital technologies are servicing the world of immigration control in the US, in California, and San Francisco, where you are.
Yes, glad to be on this panel. Thank you for moderating, Peter. Thanks to all the organizers. So yes, I'm based in San Francisco, California, and we are fighting the deportation machine here also. And so it's great to hear what's happening in the UK and also in Toronto. About, I would say, gosh, over 10 years ago, so this is not new technology, but it's been rolled out very effectively, unfortunately. About 10 years ago, the US government launched the Secure Communities Program, also known as SCOM. That's a biometrics fingerprint sharing program. And what it did was it linked local law enforcement fingerprint sharing with immigration enforcement. So it turns every single arrest by a police officer or a sheriff's deputy into basically an immigration enforcement action. What happens is that when someone is booked into a local jail or into state prison, those fingerprints used to be checked for a criminal background at the state and local level. And under Secure Communities, those fingerprints are then shared with immigration and run through their many different immigration databases. Keep in mind, those databases are extremely error prone because it is very hard to track an individual's immigration status since it is not static, it can shift, right? It can change. And so there's been litigation actually around these databases. And recently a district court judge in Southern California found that these databases were so error prone that they actually violate due process under the Fourth Amendment of the US Constitution if local law enforcement decides to hold someone based on a request from ICE generated by these databases. The litigation is still pending, and it was on appeal to the Ninth Circuit, and it's sent back to the district court, but it tells you just how all the issues with these databases. And what that has meant with the Secure Communities Program is that it has dramatically skyrocketed the number of ICE detainers or requests from Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the United States that deals with immigration enforcement at the federal level. Requests from ICE to local law enforcement has dramatically rocketed up since Secure Communities Program has been turned on. How we resist this is that in California, like you had said in the introduction of me, that I've worked in coalition with tons of amazing local advocates throughout California to move policy at the local and state level to say, well, you know what, these ICE detainer requests that you send us, they're voluntary. You're asking for a favor of local governments and the state government, and they can just say, no, it's not their job to engage in enforcing our, awful immigration system. So that's kind of what the pushback has been as a result in California. As you know, Peter, you helped us to analyze the data here. Just in the first 5 months of the enactment of our state sanctuary law known as the California Values Act, or SB 54, there was an estimated 41% decrease in ICE arrests in our local jail system and about a 24% decrease in ICE arrests statewide. We need to do that research and analysis again now, 2 years later, and I assume that that there's been more of a decrease in ICE arrests, but we still have a ton of work to do. Unfortunately, SB 54, or the California Values Act, had a lot of exceptions in there for people with a whole wide variety of convictions. It was pushed, those carve-outs or exceptions were pushed by powerful law enforcement lobbyists that had sway with Governor Brown, and certainly I'm sure have also sway with Governor Newsom, our current governor. And so, we're still dealing with that. And just kind of one more note to point out is that what's happening with those exceptions, it includes a big exception for state prisons. And what that means is that our state prison system has been transferring people on a regular basis with no limits ever since, even before SB 54, and we'll talk, I'm sure, more about this in a moment. But even under COVID, even with the global pandemic, going through our prison system and our immigration detention centers unabated, because they are congregate settings with people who already have pre-existing medical conditions due to the horrible conditions in immigration detention and state prison, not getting personal protective equipment, and just being treated horribly. As a result, COVID has been spreading rampantly, but these transfers continue. State prisons in California transferred, we're estimating about 1,400 people this year to ICE, as if there is no pandemic. It's ridiculous. And then ICE is then picking up these individuals from state prison and taking them out of state to other detention facilities in other states like Colorado and Louisiana are some of the places where our clients are currently being detained right now. And then to top it off, ICE is deporting individuals to other countries, even if individuals are experiencing COVID symptoms. And ICE is engaging in a practice of trying to cover up engaging in this practice by freezing out people, quote unquote. And we'll include an article about this, turning up the air conditioning to reduce people's fevers so they can get people on airplanes and deport them to other countries, including Guatemala. So, that's what we're experiencing right now in California, what we're trying to very hard to push back against.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'd now like to get the perspective of our Canadian leaders. I'd like now to get Sohail's perspective on this. Sohail, your work is squarely situated to see the unfolding of the carceral state in its form as both the prison system as well as its formation as the immigrant detention and deportation system. What do you see happening now in terms of the state's use of narratives of criminality and migration to lock people up, to banish them through either incarceration or deportation?
Yeah, thank you for having me, for putting this conference and this panel together. It's my pleasure to be sharing space with you all. And thank you for that question. I would like to start by saying that, as you said earlier in my bio, that I'm facing deportation to Morocco. And, so I'm, in a sense, what we call a Moroccan national. And in Morocco, there have been, a series of attempts, against migrants, along racial lines. So in Morocco, for example, I just want to use this into a segue because, in a sense, it is an international conference. This is an international problem. But I just want to start by pointing to its entanglement with anti-blackness, for example. So the immigration system and anti-blackness in Morocco. So people who own companies, bus companies, are directed by state authorities not to bring and what they call African people close to border cities. So if you want to go too close to a border city, the company won't sell you a ticket if you are quote unquote African. What does that mean? Is if you're Black, they won't sell you a ticket because border enforcement, because Morocco is like a proxy for border enforcement for European countries. So just want to put that on the record and move into the situation here. Here I see, since the beginning of COVID, several dynamics around immigration. And I can, in the beginning when COVID started, the government here in Canada said that they're going to halt the deportations, etc. The reporting started being on the phone. So for immigrants who are facing deportation back to their countries, they were forced to, for example, come to an office, report every week. Now with the new, with the novel virus and stuff, they were asked to report by phone, right? And and for me, like an immigrant that goes and have to report at those centers, it is nice that I don't have to go physically. However, that just shifting enforcement to the action of calling on the phone, it doesn't necessarily means liberation from, border enforcement services, because, there's always like a paranoia, like you don't know, like if you're gonna pick up the phone, like you don't know if they got your call, if they listen to your voicemail. Sometimes when you're facing deportation, you're under constant state of fear sometimes, like they put some fear in you that you're gonna get deported and such. Um, but the other thing, so technology is not a solution for some of us, and as immigrants who are on bail, we also fear like for geolocalization and stuff. So, for example, if I'm like going to visit my girl or something, and then I'm calling immigration from there, and I'm fearing, I'm like, am I gonna call immigration from here? Are they tracking every single of my movement? So it pervades, your private, your private life, and kind of sometimes, but of course we're human beings. We have a lot of resilience and survival skills that we can survive with these things, but they're very uncomfortable at the very bare minimum, and fatal on the other hand of the spectrum. And if we look as well here, because I was hearing my fellow panelists talking about how enforcement works in the UK and in the States, and the same thing kind of happens here when we think about how police officers like volunteer that information to immigration and border enforcement authorities, and so they don't have to do status checks. So they would call them status checks. That means calls to law enforcement when they arrest someone or they stop them to ask them question. They call border enforcement and they say, hey, do you have this name? Do they have any problems with immigration? That's not even their job. They go out of, but just like looking at it from outside of like just like a mere job description, at the end of the day, law enforcement, they are perpetuators and enforcers of racism, white supremacy, imperialism, and all these oppressive forces that trying to keep the oppressed under the boot of the oppressor. Their main goal, as someone earlier highlighted, is to also control the population. So they want to control every aspect of your life, in a sense. First of all, police target you for a stop and frisk or carding or however you call it on the streets because you're racialized, you're poor, etc., etc. Then they're digging into your immigration file, and here in Ottawa, comrades and friends from Sanctuary City, Ottawa try to stop these dynamics and advocate against them, by making Ottawa what we call a sanctuary city, but in a more expansive kind of understanding of sanctuary city, not like a very washed down liberal sense. So we started organizing and in discussions with the city, so with the city hall. But once they learned that our plans were challenging them in like a real way, they were not about this kind of facade that we want to announce that Ottawa is a sanctuary city, but we're still targeting migrants in the streets and stopping Ottawa police, stopping them, putting them in the local jail, and then deporting them and separating them from their families. So when they know that they found out that there was some substance kind of in the campaign, they gave out. They didn't want to officially make Ottawa a sanctuary city. So we started like a campaign from the bottom, but trying to make Ottawa a sanctuary city by going to service providers and sharing knowledge and procedures of how to accept people in XYZ services without the fear of deportation. So that's kind of what's going on with that. But regarding technology, I'm not very familiar with technology, but all I know is that these technologies, they have very severe and serious repercussions on the humans that are facing those, that are living those experiences and their families. in a sense.
Thank you so much, Sohail. And before I move to talk to one of our other leaders, I wanted to return to the question, my previous question about the kinds of strategies that are effective for confronting and stopping these systems of capture, and move into our conversation about abolition, because you are an abolitionist organizer, and abolitionism is really gaining momentum within alternative politics and organizing. With all your experience in this area, working at the nexus of abolition of prisons and the abolition of immigration enforcement, immigration and detention, can you give us a view of what are the crucial links between anti-immigration detention organizing and prison abolition organizing, and how abolitionism isn't just a buzzword that says I'm radical, but that it's about how it's meant for you working on clear organizing projects, policies, or alternative politics in Canada. What are the potential political potentials, the challenges of that whole thing? What is the reality of abolitionist organizing at this nexus?
So abolitionist organizing, it is a project of, not only a project of dismantling, but it's also a project of building. So it is a project of dismantling oppressive structures that keep humans in cages, that control us through surveillance, through policing, through violence, in a sense. The abolitionist project is a project that seeks to work towards a future or futures where violence is abolished, is non-existent, whether it be on the structural or the interpersonal level, because abolitionists believe that social harm, interpersonal harm, conflict have some sources, so causes. So we believe that if we dig at, or if we dig at those causes, go straight to the sources, tackle the underlying problems of social interpersonal conflict, that we will move on from that, but we believe also that we cannot move on towards those futures unless we kind of like, furnish the conditions for those futures to exist. So therefore, if, for example, we want a future free of, gender-based violence, then we have to work to tackle cis-heteropatriarchy, for example, and see how patriarchy organizes the world and organizes our social interactions, and dismantling them, and working towards those types of futures. So the carceral state, for me, works. The carceral for me works to discipline and dispose of the bodies and the souls of people who are criminalized, so people who are othered through processes of criminalization. And what it does with them is just, it puts them in human cages in order for them to conform by the norms that were established by, histories of power struggle and domination and subversion as well. In a sense, we can see that there are some very fundamental intersections between immigration and border enforcement, because border enforcement and other forms of criminalizations unrelated to the border, because it's about controlling human beings. First of all, it's about putting people in human cages, and in some forms, it's about killing them, whether it be in like the social sense or in the physical sense, because immigrants most often are killed in the social sense. I'll give you an example. A father who has a family here in so-called Canada, and who gets deported to whatever other country, the state, killed them socially, killed their social life in this land, So other than that kind of like social social genocide, we have like a physical war that is waged against migrants. We see migrants all the time being killed at the hands of the state. Here in so-called Canada, in so-called USA, we have, we hear about stories all the time of migrants being killed directly. So there's a lot of connections, and also like how the criminal justice system works in entanglement with the immigration justice system. Those are also other other points of collusion. So, for example, the double punishment of criminal inadmissibility here in so-called Canada, where when there is an immigrant who doesn't have a citizenship status, gets charged, etc., with a crime, and then they get deported because of that. So those entanglements are sometimes very clear, especially in the lives of people who are living at those intersections. And I think that, and therefore, like the mission to kind of subvert them and to go past these things is it is also complex and should touch on various things, right? So we are trying to dismantle, trying to build. So dismantling campaign can look like a lot of things. We can see Solidarité Sans Frontières here in Montreal when they are struggling against building new prisons. What did they do? They led campaign of shaming against those companies that bid on the contracts, for example. There were direct actions at the headquarters of those companies, etc. There were campaign of mobilization of supporting immigrants who are on an immigration strike, for example, at the Laval Detention Center. So those are, in a sense, abolitionist efforts, because what the people are asking for is, for their humanity to be recognized and to be allowed to live as human beings, not as not treated more rigidly than commodities that and sometimes killed in the process. Campaigns, like folks who are like Angela, Sam, and Penny, and other folks were telling us about the campaigns to kind of work within the system in a sense to regularize folks, or those campaigns also are effective. Like we see here in Canada, there's a campaign basically calling on the federal government to give a permanent resident status to all the foreign workers. So here in Canada, we import labor from the global south, and then we treat, when those immigrants come here, they're the ones who provide us with the food that ends up in our fridges. They're the one who works at at home, sometimes not all the time, at very bad conditions. And there's this campaign to regularize them, basically saying that these people come here to contribute to this land. We want to see change. We want them to be recognized, so that way they can protect themselves. That's how like organizers framed it. That way they can protect themselves from all the abuses, and they can get health care if they want. So I believe that those campaigns are important, and it's a very complex system. Some of us are chipping it away from a revolutionary sense, that we don't want to hear nothing about these already existing structures, and we want to work outside of them. So creating movement of support, in which we keep each other safe and we provide for each other. So raising money, putting it directly in the hands of people who are getting deported. Helping pay for legal fees. Mutual aid in a more general sense. That's also an effective strategy to resist carceral violence on immigrants.
Great, thank you so much, Sohail. I'd like to move back to our UK leaders. Sam, can you answer this question as well about abolition and the potential futures and challenges of it as an organizing program, organizing strategy? Can you please speak to abolition within the context of the UK?
Absolutely. I'm going to keep my video off because my internet is unstable. So apologies for that. I'll try and build off what Sohail said very eloquently as well. So yeah, I think there's absolutely links between anti-immigration detention and abolition. I think there's a lot to be learned, particularly from the prison abolition movement in the US and how that can map onto anti-immigration detention work. I think abolition can help us situate immigration detention in its wider political and economic context, and keep reminding us that detention doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that actually, if we were to campaign against detention as if it were happening in a vacuum, the end result would likely be a shifting around of problems rather than a solving of them. I remember reading brilliant Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a prison abolitionist in the US, who I'm sure some of the other panelists in North America will know better than I. But she really informed my thinking about this, and this idea that abolition is both that long-term goal, but also includes practical policy suggestions. So it's very much thinking about the world as it should be, looking at the world as it is, and then how can we bridge that gap? And prison and detention are linked both on a on that conceptual and practical level. And Sohail was speaking to this already. Conceptually, both systems are rooted in an impulse to exclude those considered undesirable, and that can break down, and that does break down along kind of racialized grounds. Obviously, practically, that those connections we can see in the outsourcing of and the privatization of the prison estate, but also immigration detention centres, which results in a similar lack of accountability and transparency, issues of people dying in detention centres, dying in prisons, but also the very physical infrastructure. Prisons become detention centres revert back to prisons, and that infrastructure is very much interconnected. So campaigning against new detention centres, new prisons, those things are really related, as well as obviously the real tangible intersection of these issues, where you've got hundreds of people held in prison under immigration detention powers, having already served sentences. So really trying to get to grips with what is essentially prison to deportation pipeline. You asked a question, Peter, about kind of abolition being a kind of new buzzword. Does it speak to a more radical bent? And yeah, I think it's important that we don't pitch abolition against reform or whatever kind of terminology you want to use. We don't want to. We've got to be careful not to divide people who are all seeking positive change, and I think there's kind of explanation of what abolition means and what that framework looks like, because we know that detention isn't going to disappear overnight, and you can fight for better. You can fight for those kind of tangible improvements and an alternative structure at the same time. But what we do need to do is work out which reforms fit into a system change and which ones entrench the existing system. And that's a conversation that we need to have in good faith. And I think that's probably better understood, in my view, when we're talking about police abolition or prison abolition than it is within talking about detention abolition, certainly in the UK sector. But as I said, I think we need to work out which reforms fit where, which ones are helpful, which ones aren't. Always asking ourselves, are we moving towards that world as it should be? Does this does this reform get us closer to that, or does it just entrench the system as it is?
Thank you so much, Sam. Penny, could we move to you? Could you give us your thoughts on the potentials and challenges of abolition in the UK and what it looks like at the nexus of anti-racist organizing, anti-surveillance organizing, anti-detention organizing, anti-deportation organizing?
Yeah, I think again, I'm really glad, and yeah, I've been listening to what the other speakers have said, and I think they've said a lot that I would have added, but just a few points is around the link. There's a huge similarity between the prison industrial complex and the immigration detention centers here. They're multi-million pound companies. The shareholders are linked to government and how the tenders are given and the amount of money they make. So for example, here we have G4S, we have Circle, who have a horrible track record of kind of human rights abuse, whether it's raping women or people dying whilst they're being deported, because it's the same companies who actually, the chartered flights that are kind of set up and who gets to benefit from all of that. So that there is that similarity. So I think in terms of pushing back on and the same with the security guards, how they treat, and I think Sohail spoke to that, the level of dehumanization that goes in terms of people seen as less than, and the conditions that the people were living in the migration centers here, in terms of mental health, in terms of misdiagnosis as well. Again, this goes in even people who are in prison. The fact that the traumas that they've escaped and what they're experiencing whilst they're here, not just the triggers, but re-traumatized over and over. And it's almost like nobody cares. And it goes back to that point that I mentioned earlier. What is it that they're running away from? Because it is the legacies that they've endured, whether it's what happened, whether it's Francophone countries, whether it's what British colonialism, whatever it is. And I think that the challenge then kind of coming forward is the fact that this history is not known, this history is not rendered. And I think the way the narrative is sold, which is why I said that whole idea of somebody's a criminal, they need to get locked up, and therefore they lose our compassion, they lose our sense of care, because suddenly they've been put this title that they're a criminal, and without necessarily looking underneath at what are the factors that have led to this. Same thing with migration. What are the factors that have led to, and I think I did see a question there, somebody saying how is climate connected? And we have to see capitalism as being the heart of all of what we experience. And then obviously now we have neoliberalism and kind of the how it manifests itself. But because of that idea that people just want to make money, individualism, and it's about state, it's about, which is again imperialism, it means we don't care for anything unless it's for us. When it comes to migration, when it comes to people it's so much, they're coming here to take from us. And actually what we have in the West is what's been taken, exploits and taken from those countries. And unless people understand that history that's often distorted, that's often hidden, they'll still see as what they're coming for. And we need to be telling them how the conditions that they should be in, as opposed to actually what they're suffering and running away from is connected. So the point around the climate is, for example, just using Congo or using Haiti even. Haiti, who are the first ones to kind of kick off France, they had to pay reparations, and they've been paying in terms of the poverty that they experience now. Come hurricanes, come earthquakes, they haven't got the capacity to respond to that. So the criminality we see, or if we kind of call it that, they're running the Congo again, the climate solutions that we see now, people are saying, oh yeah, let's go electric. What is that at cost from? What is it costing the global or majority world? It's the batteries. Who's going down the mines to mine those batteries? What are we giving them in exchange? How much tax evasion? We've got Canada, for example, that takes a lot out of Congo in terms of tax avoidance. And then those people kill each other, they run away and they come here. And then what are they met with? And I think that's the connection I was talking about earlier, about the interconnectedness. The challenge, as I see it, is is the sense of apathy. So the fear and anxiety around, as I said, that us and them, the othering, I think Sohail spoke about that as well, means it's very hard to have that compassion. The challenge also from those of us who are Black, migrant, or brown, or other multiple factors, even poor, is the apathy, the powerlessness, the traumatization. Means we're not often able or to kind of continue to push forward. And it's because the state will come down hard on us. A lot of the work, as I said, we work majority with Black and brown communities, but the reason why the fear getting out and saying some of the things that I feel like some of us, or I'm able to say, is, oh, I'm going to get deported, I'm going to get I'm going to have my status, I haven't got my status yet. That level of living in those conditions is what most people live, and so I feel that continues to be a challenge. Another challenge, kind of looking at the bigger and the broader, is passing the back. So it's not my bag, this is not for me, this is for them. And I think to really move forward to in terms of challenging, it's understanding the complexity of what damage imperialism has caused, and feeling there's a debt. So we talk about reparations, or a climate debt, or a debt that is owed to these communities who are having to come to this. I think the example that Sohail was saying about, you want to go hang out with somebody and now you've got to ring up. Why are we even asking them to ring up? Why are they signing? What have they done aside from run to save their lives? What have they done? Why have we criminalized them? And I think it's until people or people are able to ask themselves those questions that we're able to kind of really turn the game around. And because what we see, and I think I use the Jim Crow era as an example of how people became state players. People were forced into becoming complacent, because with the hostile environment, for example, the employers are fined for not asking people for papers before they employ them. So what do? Or I have to do this because otherwise the state is I'm going to get fined. The same thing happens with the GPs or the housing, that when the people, the landlords were saying, if I give you accommodation without checking your status, the state is going to come hard on me. So it means, but if one of us refuses, yes, one of us gets criminalized, one of us gets fined, one of us gets a business shut down. But imagine if all of us really said, hang on, what have we lost? Because the campaign I mentioned earlier, the one that we're working on, it was the same context as Sohail mentioned, of the police, they stop you, they're like judge and jury, they decide to ring the Home Office or not. So at that moment, imagine that this guy's got your life in their hands, because, and then what we are also have been campaigning is the Home Office has the records wrong. We saw with the Windrush and how messed up that system, or we've seen with how things disappear as well with Grenfell. So when they ring up is because you're a person of interest, and then how that turns around on you is a result of that. So it's kind of like now asking people, why do we need to live with this kind of, because I use, and I have said, the hostile environment for me is apartheid, because it's one rule for everybody else. And this is in countries who talk about the Equality Act, who say you should not be treated differently because of your color of your skin or where you were born. But at the same time, it's like, hang on, where were you born? Where is your passport? Are you regularized? So it's saying, how is it that we can live in the 21st century when we look back and say, I can't believe they had rules for, you can't go on that area, you can't live on that, you can't go to that school. Yet we have exactly that happening right now. So the conditions of people living in fear in and amongst us, next door to us, people sleeping in the streets because of all of these conditions, I think we need, and I think COVID has done something around reawakening people's humanity because of the immortality of like, oh my God, what if all this ended? And I think we need to tap on that a little bit more in terms of to get past this challenge that we have of seeing and understanding and seeing from each other's point of view, as opposed to it's not my bag, so therefore, move on, I have to do this because the state tells me to do. We need to be questioning, what are we complying with, and what does it mean for those of us who are marginalized, or for those communities who are really vulnerable.
Thank you so much, Penny. I really appreciate it. Now, quickly, I want to just move back to Angela in San Francisco. We just have a couple of minutes, and then I'd like to open it up to one question from the people who are watching. Angela, you sit at this sort of juncture of grassroots mobilizing to pressure the state, and at the same time worked very closely with policymakers and department heads on the inside of the government, but working on policy which had very abolitionist goals, in the sense of reducing deportation, defunding police, defunding sheriffs, cutting contracts with detention. Can you tell us, can you give us quickly your thoughts? I'm sorry to make it shorter, but if you could give us some thoughts on the sort of potentiality of abolitionism in this nexus of anti-deportation and anti-detention in San Francisco and California and the US. It's a tall order in a couple.
Yes. Well, I always think about it in terms of how do we move decision makers, right? How do we move politicians who are usually very interested in their own re-election and their own legacy, rather than the safety and well-being of all of our people. And that's not always the case. There are some amazing elected folks, but there are many more who are not so amazing. And so the way we do it is we will often point to them how this is actually, good for their legacy. That if you look at the long arc of incarceration in the United States and beyond the United States, incarceration, our experiment with incarceration has not proven successful, right? It doesn't increase public safety. It doesn't reduce recidivism. And what it does is just drains resources, right? From other much more effective institutions like education, healthcare, mental health care, safe and affordable housing, right? If individuals had all of these resources, certainly they'd be less likely to be criminalized, right? If they weren't living in communities that were under-resourced and over-criminalized, it would be less likely that they would be funneled into these, into our prison and jail and immigration detention centers. So that's how we explain it to politicians, that this is in their interest, right? There's interest convergence here, to borrow that idea from critical race theory, that it benefits them if they were to take an interest in the most vulnerable and marginalized and criminalized of our communities. And to give a very quick example of this, then Mayor Gavin Newsom, he's now the governor of California. When he was mayor, as you know, Peter, in San Francisco, he turned over hundreds of kids to ICE, right? People under 18 years old to ICE when they got in contact with the juvenile system. And when he ran for governor, about maybe 8-10 years later, he was asked about this, right? He was asked by reporters about this. And initially he defended his policy and also just played dumb and said, wasn't the intention to turn over kids to ICE, and when that's exactly what his policy required. And then after getting pushed into several news articles later, he then apologized and said, actually, I wouldn't do that if I had the chance again. That was a mistake. I regret it, right? And then continued on and won his governor campaign. Same thing with Kamala Harris, right? Who's now our vice president-elect. She was the district attorney in San Francisco at the time all these kids were getting turned over to ICE under Newsom's direction, someone who she's very close with, and did nothing about it, and in fact, defended it. And she was asked the same thing by a number of reporters as she was getting vetted when she was running for president. And she did the same thing, the same dance. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not the purpose of the policy. And then, of course, an apology. And so we want to kind of share that lesson with other politicians also seeking continued and higher office. So that's kind of how we bridge that connection between politics and abolition.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. So now, just very quickly, we have about 10 minutes left. I just wanted to open it up to the panel. There's a question from the audience. So is there a danger that abolitionist demands in relation to immigration policy come across as maximalist and contribute to the already deep polarization across society? What is the scope for a more transitional approach aiming to challenge the presumption that immigration can only be viewed from a law and order perspective and needs to be managed through police-style controls? So I think anybody who wants to answer, please feel free to.
I'll go. I'll put my video.
Oh, and I'm sorry, you can all you can all open up your videos so everyone can see.
Yeah. I don't know. This question is a good question, just because I think about it sometimes and such. But I also want to like invite folks. I don't know. Like I want to invite folks when thinking about this question to maybe think about it from like start thinking about it from like where I start in a sense. I think about it that like we are like the oppressed is the traumatized. You know, like the oppressed is the one who is suffering from the consequences of this unhindered state violence, you know. So when the oppressed sometimes talks, the oppressed has no choice but to scream because they are put in a corner. They are, they know they went inside the belly of the beast, they examined it, and thankfully the belly spit them out and let them survive with us, you know. So in a sense, like we should not have very much expectations, you know, from folks, you know, to be like quote unquote like civil or like nice or respectable, you know, when we're talking about these issues. Because when you come in my house, you break my door and you make my family go through trauma, and there is no more niceness left there for me to be nice to you. I can be nice to you because I'm being angry out of love. You know what I mean? I'm telling you that we need abolition as our own our direction, our only direction in the future, or like amongst our liberatory directions in the future, you know, as like a as like something that is very urgent, that if we don't implement and we don't work towards in the right now, many more lives are going to be lost, and many of our kins are going to be still targeted by these things. So I guess that the struggle or the political struggle, it's like it's very complex, and like framing, and like how politicians themselves like they contribute to the demonization of the migrant through like basically like their policies, and how those policies kind of like shape and shapes culture, and how culture, you know, shapes perception and such, you know. So of course, we should be careful when we frame in certain issues, but for me, sometimes I rather talk to the person or to the system, to the structure of power, to representative of the structure of power, and tell them how it is, and make them feel uncomfortable, because I myself am uncomfortable, and I'm beyond uncomfortable. You know what I mean? And I know that people are beyond uncomfortable. So and also, yeah, so that the discomfort that might be felt by those politicians, for me, is necessary. You know, is a necessary part of the struggle, because though I understand, and I'm kind of like coming at it from like empathy, and from like a transformative lens, and trying to look at fascists from a transformative lens, you know what I mean? So, you know, like I understand where they're coming from, you know what I mean? Because I was not always perfect too, you know. I was I reproduced racism, I reproduced patriarchy, these things at some point of my life too, you know. So I cannot like overjudge, but I must struggle, because that's where kind of like I find myself anyways. And I'll let other folks maybe continue.
Thank you, Sohail. Would anyone else like to answer?
I think mine might be very brief. Just, and I think it goes back to maybe Kwame Ture, who talks about reformism as against or versus revolution. And I think the idea of appeasing and constantly reforming a broken system is what's perhaps got us here, because we're the ones trying to kind of do this softly approach, and then they just come bang, and whatever it is that they're doing is complete contrast. So I see how the two differences of how do we get and move forward, but I also see the frustration of actually why are we trying to mend something, because capitalism, as I said, or even the system as it exists right now, is not meant for some of us. The inequality is created, is by design, and it's meant to be like that. So for us to really make it work, it needs a complete change. And so the conversation I said about the histories of enslavement, histories of colonialism, histories of classism and all of that, the political literacy, I think once that happens, people would think we don't need change, we need to complete a complete new thing, get rid of what we have.
Thank you, Penny. Sam, would you like to respond? We have, go ahead. Yes, some time.
Yeah, I appreciate that question from Dawn. I think that, historically and now, we've taken a maximalist approach to building prisons and to criminalizing our communities and detaining and deporting our communities. And so the only way to push back is also a maximalist approach and not kind of a transitional or incremental approach. I've certainly tried every incremental and transitional approach that I can think of in the last 14 years or so that I've been doing this work, and the system, it just recreates itself, as Penny was saying. You can spend your time, for example, training police officers to not be racist. That does not reduce officer-involved shootings of people of color. So, that's kind of a lesson learned. I think a lot of criminal justice advocates and immigrant rights advocates are really grappling now with this decades of attempts at a transitional approach and how not very far it's gotten us. And I would say, when we work on prison abolition, it's, ideally, yes, we close down as many prisons as possible now, but knowing that that's a huge feat and that we need to build new systems, alternatives that are healthier and less racist at the same time, right? We also kind of keep in mind as a North Star when we do our work on a daily basis. And so this can happen in a very micro level, working on abolition. So for example, at the Asian Law Caucus, our nonprofit based in San Francisco, we get lots of requests from partner organizations that we respect and work well with, that are well-intentioned, that ask us to support this or that legislation. But if we look deeper at it, in some of those cases, it's adding criminal codes, it's adding penal codes, enhancing sentences for what are usually more, leftist causes, like stopping human trafficking, dealing with domestic violence, for example. And when we look at that and we have our guiding North Star of abolition, we explain very politely that no, we can't support this effort because it further builds our criminal justice system, even if that might not be their intention. So that's kind of a way we work on an everyday level, but I would say it also helps guide us to figure out what our work should be, right? If you are a prison abolitionist, you won't spend time, for example, advocating for body cameras for police officers, because it just means more money and technology for them, right? It helps kind of answer these questions about where we should put our limited time and resources.
Sam, any final words on abolition and on this question?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I really hear what Don's saying, and as someone who spends this time trying to convince Conservative MPs to back X and X, you do have to think about audiences and the change that you're trying to implement. But I really agree with Angela, and I think it goes back to the point I was trying to make about knowing the framework within the changes that you're seeking to create, and knowing what's useful, what entrenches the system, and what moves you towards that system not being there. The training one is the perfect example. We might disagree as a sector as to what falls where, but we should be having that conversation as to which policies fit in which bracket. I think having that vision of where we're heading to and uniting behind that can help us agree on the steps that we need to take to get there.
Wonderful. Well, it's time to wrap up. Before you all go, I just want to encourage and recommend all of you to tune into the next panel in the series, which is tomorrow from 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's titled Decent Work for Undocumented Residents in Cities. It's going to be a wonderful conversation. I'm a former labor researcher, I'm definitely going to be there. It sounds like it's going to be a great panel. I really want to thank our panelists for this great conversation. Today, we were joined by Sohail Bensleiman, coordinator of the Jail Accountability and Information Line in Ottawa, Canada. Sam Grant, the Policy and Campaigns Manager at Liberty in London. Penny Wangari-Jones, Director of the Racial Justice Network in Yorkshire, England. And Angela Chan, Policy Director and Senior Staff Attorney at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. I also want to thank Rachel Humphreys and Graham Hudson for organizing this wonderful series of events and the organizing committee of the series as well. And the sponsors of the event, which included Ryerson University Faculty of Law, the University of San Francisco, Queen Mary University of London, the Leverhulme Trust, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, Migrant Workers for Change, No One is Illegal, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus. I'm Peter Mancina, researcher at Stockholm University and visiting scholar at the Center for Immigration Law, Policy and Justice at Rutgers Law School, and research associate at the University of Oxford. I really want to thank you all for coming. We've learned a lot here today about the rapidly moving technological detention and deportation landscape in the US, UK, and Canada. It's not insurmountable to fight these systems and defund them and build alternative social structures. We can govern ourselves differently and in ways that will work better than those that use immobilization and removal. I encourage you all to get involved in the movement in whatever way you can. Definitely follow the work of these wonderful speakers that you've heard from tonight. Read the reports and articles written by these folks that Graham and Rachel, and other articles and reports that Graham and Rachel have linked to in the chat box, and that our participants have linked to in the chat box. Please take care of yourselves and keep taking that next step forward. So that concludes this panel. Take care, everybody, and thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.